Well, let's start with Russia, because in the last hour or so, Vladimir Putin has accused Ukraine of trying to provoke Russia with this morning's drone attack on Moscow and claiming that the drones were aimed at civilian targets. Well, there are no reports of deaths from this morning's incident, but several buildings were damaged. Russia's foreign ministry said that the country has the right to take the harshest measures in response. Meanwhile, Ukraine has denied responsibility for those scenes and that attack. This was Vladimir Putin, though, in the last little while.
As a response, as you know, the Kiev regime chose a different path of frightening Russia, frightening the citizens of Russia, and hitting the residential buildings. Of course, this is a clear sign of terrorist activity. Well, first of all, I want to say the air defence system of Moscow worked normally, satisfactorily, although there are things to work on.
Well, more on those comments in a moment, but let's focus on those drones attacking Moscow. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, was in the city when the attack took place.
Russian TV says this is the moment that Moscow came under attack. From early morning, people in and around the Russian capital reported hearing explosions. I did too. At home, my windows shook from the force of the blasts. Russia's defense ministry says that Ukraine had targeted Moscow with drones. The Russian military claimed it had brought them all down. Look at that, a man says in this video, right above our house. Later, Russian investigators announced that no one had been injured. They've opened an official investigation into the attack. One of the drones had crashed into a high-rise apartment block. Another reportedly flew into this residential building. Here's part of it on the ground. It had failed to explode. The area was cordoned off and emergency services removed it. Amongst local residents, the sense of shock is palpable. We're all on edge, Marat says. I don't know what we should do about it. I fear for my life and the lives of my loved ones, says Yelena. Things are not as calm and stable as we've been told.
The Moscow authorities say there was minor damage, no serious injuries, and the situation is under control. But for Muscovites, this drone attack is a wake-up call, a sign that this war, that many here still perceive as being far away, is coming much closer to home.
That feeling has been growing since these explosions over the Kremlin earlier this month, an apparent drone attack. And just days ago, a large-scale cross-border incursion from Ukraine into Russian territory was another embarrassment for the Russian authorities and a sign of growing insecurity. But no sign of any political U-turn. After this morning's drone attack, the message from the Kremlin is clear. What it calls the special military operation in Ukraine will continue.
Well, worth telling you in the last few minutes, lines coming to us from the White House about all of this. The White House saying they're still gathering information about what actually happened in Moscow, commenting on the drone attacks. They said, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. And they said they're focused on helping Ukraine retake its sovereign territory. You can see between the lines there the concern, of course, the concern always with any sort of attack on Russian sovereign territory is the possibility of escalation. Hence those comments from Vladimir Putin that we've been looking at, hence the Ukrainian denials. But certainly the White House trying to find out more information on the nature of those drone attacks on Moscow a little earlier in the day. Well, I've been talking to our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, and I asked him if what we'd heard from Vladimir Putin so far today showed that these attacks had touched a nerve.
I think this is something where whoever was responsible, the intention seems to have been to give Muscovites a flavour of what the people of Kiev have been experiencing for months, and in particular during the month of May, when Kiev has come under such repeated attack. The scale of what happened in Moscow overnight was very small by comparison, but the impact, the sort of psychological impact, is clearly designed to mirror that in some way, to sow a level of uncertainty and fear among the people of Moscow.
The Foreign Ministry has talked about taking the harshest of measures in response. It's unclear, though, where they might go tactically, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's partly because we don't yet know really where this attack came from. I mean, there is an assumption that Ukraine was behind it in some way or another, but I've been talking to an expert who has been taking a close look at the airframes involved, which are rather novel ones, which seem to be kind of modified, commercially available airframes. And his belief is that while it is perfectly possible that they could have been fired from inside Ukraine, some 500 kilometers or so from the Russian capital, he thought it more likely that they were fired from somewhere much closer to Moscow. He didn't think that that would have been a particularly complicated thing to carry out. These are small devices. They didn't seem to be equipped with very much in the way of explosive munitions. So he thinks that possibly they were carried out in some way by operatives inside Russia, perhaps with Ukrainian direction, but really not with any particular desire of achieving a kind of explosive result. This was more about sending a message of capability and, as I said before, just injecting an element of fear and uncertainty into the minds of the people of Moscow, but also, of course, the Russian leadership, that this is something that Ukraine or sympathizers of Ukraine are capable of.
Yes, interesting, because Ukraine's presidential spokesman talked about Ukraine having no direct involvement in this attack, but didn't say there wasn't some sort of indirect involvement, exactly what you're alluding to in that answer. But in terms of the other way, we've seen the 17th straight attack this month on the capital, Kyiv, and again, people trying to work out tactically what Russia is doing in advance of the anticipated counteroffensive from Ukraine.
Yes, it is difficult to know exactly what Russia's intentions are, because, even though these have robbed a lot of the people of Kiev of many, many hours of sleep and have caused a great deal of sort of psychological distress, the attacks aren't really hitting any significant targets. It's interesting, for example, that at no point in this war so far have Russian missiles or drones hit any Ukrainian government facilities in Kiev. It simply hasn't happened yet. So this is a kind of drip psychological impact, possibly designed, when one thinks about the kind of tactics involved, to soak up valuable and expensive Ukrainian air defenses in a way that is, that is significantly degrading of Ukraine's capabilities. But all the while, as you said in your question, all the while, Ukraine is getting ready for its counteroffensive, and we are seeing every day now significant attacks on Russian military targets inside occupied Ukraine, in areas, for example, like Mariupol, where ammunition dumps, fuel supplies, troop concentrations are being targeted, not with these rather minor drones that we saw used in Moscow, but by significant bits of Western supplied equipment, including the British supplied Storm Shadow missiles. That is the real military business that is going on right now. We're not hearing a great deal about it, but it is clearly setting the scene for some kind of attack which may or may not be imminent by the Ukrainians, and they want to get it right, and they're perfectly happy to do a bit of distraction on the side while they get ready for the main task at hand.
Well, that was our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams. Let's cross live to Washington. Let's speak to Christine Berzina, who's Managing Director for German Marshall Fund North. Thank you so much for being here on the programme. Your take in terms of your analysis of that attack on Moscow today?
I think it's a very important moment in the war today when you see the first attack on Moscow. There were the drones over the Kremlin, but this is taking the war to the Russian people. It has been over a year, and frankly, since Crimea, that Russia has been waging a war on Ukrainians, on Ukrainian soil. And so, yes, we don't have attribution right now from Kiev or the official authorities on this, but the likelihood is that this attack is from a Ukraine-affiliated group, if not the Ukrainian military itself, and in which case it is an expression of the realness of this conflict, of this war for the Russian people. If Ukrainians and if those in Kiev who get attacked night after night, running for over a year into bomb shelters in their basements, if they have been living like this, then mostly Russia has been immune. Conscripts, of course, have had to fight on the front lines, and there are volunteers who have fought. But for the average Russian, the war has been relatively abstract. And as of today, as of these drone attacks, it isn't abstract any longer. It is something that could hurt them in their homes in the way that Russia has been waging a war to hurt and to kill Ukrainians in their homes. The attacks from Russia on civilian, on residential infrastructure, on houses, on
Yes.
hospitals. This has been, the terroristic element of this war. And right now we see that in this pre-offensive, or maybe in the first moments of this counteroffensive that Ukraine is launching, it is a difference not only in the power that Ukraine is bringing to take back, but potentially for those who support Ukraine or Ukraine to say this war is not going to be fought on Russia's terms,
Yes.
that Ukraine is capable of setting different terms.
If that analysis is correct, what are the risks? Because I just read out from the White House, they're trying to obviously find out a little more about what was behind today's attack, but went on to say we do not support attacks inside of Russia. We've had the official denials from Ukraine, but there's always been real worry, certainly in Western capitals, of the scope of Ukrainian attacks spilling over into Russian sovereign territory. What do you think are the likely consequences of that, if that's what we've seen?
So I think that we are seeing Ukraine, or those who support Ukraine, play a very delicate dance here. It is really important for the Western partners who support Ukraine not to have their equipment used, in particular in Russia, and they do not permit and do not want Ukraine to be striking within Russia itself. That is different from what the voices in Ukraine, not all, but some, might want to see happen. And when we saw in Belgorod these Ukrainian Russians who had been trained in Ukraine, who then wanted to go back in Belgorod, and these strikes in recent weeks. That is a different example of something that is not quite Ukrainian, but is against Russia. And that balance is important because Ukraine does not want to jeopardize the support of the West. And the West, in particular the United States, Germany, are countries that are incredibly fearful of escalation. And so as we look at next steps, we'll have to see, where were the drones made, who is operating them. The technical details about what was used and how it was used will be very important in the question about what kind of escalation is there, and is there escalation at all.
Exactly what our BBC Verified team are looking at as we speak. Just a final quick thought, if you would, because we've seen the 17th straight day of attacks on the Ukrainian capital. In terms of tactically what you think the Russians might be doing, is there a possibility here that they're focusing on Kyiv to somehow tie up the various defences from perhaps the battlefield site where any counteroffensive may come?
It's important for Russia to try to weaken Ukraine as much as possible before an attack. If Russia wants to win, as they do, they want a weaker Ukraine. But the air defense systems that are protecting Kiev are going to stay in place. And so if they are trying to run them down of ammunition, this could be perhaps a precursor to more significant strikes in Ukraine later. It's, of course, related to the counteroffensive, but it isn't as though that which is used to protect Kiev is going to immediately move to the front lines. There are things that are staying relatively in place, but I would worry that a desire to dramatically run down the ammunition that the air defense systems have, their ability to protect the city, that in fact could open the city up for other kinds of attacks in the future from Russia. Again, this isn't a one-for-one. The front line is enormous, and now when we are seeing strikes in Russia and strikes across Ukraine, it's a very complicated chess game, and we just have to try to keep all of it in mind as we navigate what is happening right now and what's going to happen in the future.
Christine Berzina, thank you so much for joining us live there from Washington. As we were talking there, I just noticed that the head of the Wagner group just given recent comments really angry at what has happened today, lashing out at Russia's defense ministry, accusing them of not doing enough to prevent the drone attacks on Moscow. So that's an interesting latest line on that, very much our main story that is dominating here today.